Everyone, this is what your pastor didn't tell you. Today I am an ancient first century Greek. What am I, a philosopher? I don't know. You tell me in the comments. For those that don't know me, other than being a first century Greek person, I am also a biblical studies student at New Covenant. That's really awkward. What's my college names? Um, yeah, Covenant Theological Seminary. That's really awkward. All right, yeah, but biblical studies student, and I'm trying to give some thoughts into the discussion of the complementarian, egalitarian positions. Today, we are specifically looking about a article on the topic. Someone named Denny Burk responded to the book by Sandra Glahn on, or Sandra, I don't know, nobody's mother, and the title is Artemis can't undermine complementarianism. So that's a really big claim. Let's talk about that today. We're going to get into the specific views. We're also going to talk about, what we should think about, women in ministry, and should they be pastors, stuff like that. So, people who do not know who Denny Burk is, he is a professor of biblical studies and ethics at Boyce College, where he's the director of the Center for Gospel and Culture. More specifically, he is the president of the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. So, this is a big time shot caller, right? So, he should know what he's talking about. We'll see today what we should think about it all. Now, of course, we have a lovely little picture of the Artemis Temple. Why that's significant, we'll talk about that later. Uh, Before we begin, first things first, so comments in the live chat, make sure to try to keep them on topic. If they are not on topic, then I probably won't answer them. But if they are on topic, I'll try my best to answer. And not only that, if they're super chat, I'll definitely answer. Conversation. This is not a conversation between like people that disagree about the main things of Christianity. This is just a conversation about. It's not a fight. It's a conversation between me, Sandra Glahn, uh, Denny Burk, on just how we're supposed to understand the passage. So this is not something to be fighting over. Not something to get emotional over. Although it's understandable why you would. But priorities, keep the priorities in perspective here. Hey, JS. Alrighty. So, last thing, don't let feeling good about something one of us says mean that you are correct. Who am I supposed to be? I am a first century Greek person. That's all I know about myself. It's been a long time. I forgot. So, all right. So let's get into the article here. All right. Paul's words in 1 Timothy 2, 8-15 have long been watershed in the debate between complementarians and egalitarians. So for those who aren't familiar, for the most part, complementarians believe that women should be pastors, or that they should not be pastors. Egalitarians, for the most part, believe that they don't have a problem with women being pastors. Specifically, obviously, their views are a little bit more complicated than that, but for this discussion, that's what's most important here. In talking about Paul, he addresses both men and women as they come together for public worship, as well as the particular danger women face in childbearing. So this is his summary of the text. Complementarians have generally understood Paul's prohibition in verse 12 to restrict women from certain governing and teaching roles within the church, and have understood save through childbearing in verse 15 to relate in some way to the special calling of motherhood. Egalitarians have construed these texts to place no restrictions on women in teaching or leadership, even as they acknowledge the dangers associated with childbearing. So definitely, a credible position, obviously a very popular one. He says, over the last several decades, the barrels of ink have been spilled trying to sort out the issues, with both sides trying to win the battle of persuasion. The controversy shows no signs of abating anytime soon. Yep, so specifically in the last 100, 200 years, although it's been talked about before that, but you know, specifically recently, that you have all kinds of books and articles and scholarship being written about this topic. Very important topic for a lot of people these days. So, Enter Sandra Glahn, professor of media arts and worship at Dallas Theological Seminary. She advances a provocative and somewhat novel thesis in her new book, Nobody's Mother, Artemis of the Ephesians in Antiquity and the New Testament. The book is one part personal narrative and another part study of New Testament backgrounds. She focuses on how the worship of the goddess Artemis in first century Ephesus should inform our interpretation of the pastoral epistles. In particular, she's concerned with how false teaching emanating from the local Artemis cult shapes our understanding of Paul's contention that women will be saved through childbearing. So, something I did like about this article, for the most part, he does a pretty good job of explaining her views. What I will say is that a big chunk of her book, most of the book, is not actually that related to the whole women in ministry discussion. A lot of it is just understanding what Artemis was back in this ancient time. And while some of it was a little bit, relevant to the discussion, in a lot of ways, it didn't, a big part of the book didn't have that much to do with the biblical text. Along the way, Glahn also offers a fresh interpretation of the entire paragraph, including comments on the much disputed prohibition in verse 12. I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, but to remain quiet. That's the NASB translation. Her conclusions fall in line with the egalitarian stream of interpretation for this key text. So I would agree, it's worth mentioning that she is not specifically a egalitarian. She doesn't go by that word. I don't know her specific views on why she wouldn't and all that, but maybe we'll talk about that another time. Also, make sure to like and subscribe because I'll be interviewing her on this book at a later time here. So, something else that was funny and interesting to me was that they actually linked her book and even gave you a way to purchase it on Amazon. So that was nice of them, even though they're critiquing, they're giving some creds, giving her a way to, make some money. So he says, Glahn says the impetus for her project is personal. Having grown up in a Christian home, she witnessed a vision for biblical womanhood in her mother. Talks about her background. I don't see how it's that significant. We won't read through it. She was on the hordes of a dilemma. She had 1 Timothy 2:15 saying motherhood was the proper context for stewarding her teaching gift, but motherhood wasn't an option. So how she came to the conclusion of that certainly mentioned in the book. Not too relevant for this discussion. So her understanding of verses 8 to 15 became transformed by an in-depth study of the Artemis cult in first century Ephesus, right? So then the Krogers, so this is worth mentioning here. So a small section of her book was in response to Richard and Catherine and Kruger, I don't know, who wrote a book in 1992 contending that Artemis worship was the background to Paul's words in these verses. And I'm pretty sure they're egalitarian. So this is slightly in critiquing their views, but she agreed with the overall take on the views. So he says the Krogers argued Artemis was a mothering fertility goddess whose cult had made inroads into the Ephesian church through false teaching. The apparent prohibition against women teaching men in church, therefore, is a warning against specific Ephesian doctrinal error and not a general instruction. From an extensive examination of ancient literary sources, inscriptions, and architecture art, Glahn contends, contrary to the Krogers, that Artemis wasn't connected with fertility, but with virginity and midwifery. Thus, Artemis was nobody's mother. Fun little name there. Nevertheless, though Glahn believes the Krogers understood the Artemis cult incorrectly, she argues they were right to read verses 8 to 15 as a refutation of false teachers under the spell of the Artemis cult. In this light, saved through childbearing should be understood as a local proverb, she says, that assures Ephesian women they don't need the help of the divine midwife Artemis to be safe during childbearing. On the contrary, a woman who converted from worshiping Artemis to following Jesus would be kept safe through childbirth and wouldn't die, according to Glahn. According to Glahn, Artemis was thought to deliver painlessly or euthanize women in childbirth. But Jesus is better. He will save through childbearing those who continue in faith, love, and holiness with self-control. She continues, this is not to suggest Paul is making a universal statement that would be true of all women in all eras, Rather, it would be true in the case of Timothy and his congregation in the short term, a promise that in this foundational period of their assembly, their God would prove himself bigger than the God of the surrounding culture. We'll get into that later a little bit. All right. Likewise, Glahn argues, Paul's prohibition in verse 12 isn't a universal command intended for all people at all times. Paul merely addresses a local problem in Ephesus, in which husbands and wives were particularly rancorous during worship. While husbands need to put away anger and dispute, wives need to stop teaching with the view to dominating their husbands. When Paul grounds this prohibition in the fact that Adam was formed first and that Eve was deceived, God claims he isn't appealing to creation order or natural differences between men and women. He's simply correcting a false narrative that puts Artemis first with a true story that puts Adam first. We will go into that later as well. Let me see if there's anything notes I want to respond to there. Okay, yep, not ready yet. All right. Insufficient evidence. This is the real meat of the arguments here, the review. He what's his name? Yeah, Denny says, if Nobody's Mother was merely an analysis of Artemis worship in first century Ephesus, this volume would be grist for scholars to discuss, but hardly worthy of review in a popular level forum like this one. But that's not the kind of book Glahn has written. She has amassed research on the Artemis cult as the hermeneutical key to Paul's meaning in 1 Timothy. She argues that if readers fail to recognize Paul's words as a polemic against the Artemis cult, they will not understand what saved through childbearing means in verse 15, much less Paul's apparent prohibition on women teaching in verse 12. This is the primary weakness of Nobody's Mother. Glahn asserts that Artemis cult is the foundation for everything Paul says in verses 8 to 15, without demonstrating it to be the case. So she does not demonstrate it to be the case. Let's see why. And he says there's a reason why he doesn't demonstrate, or there's a reason why she doesn't demonstrate it to be the case. It cannot be supported from the text of 1 Timothy. So basically he's like, you cannot support her case from 1 Timothy. That's a big claim. Paul never mentions Artemis. He never refers to the temple devoted to Artemis. He never refers to the cult. He never refers to mythology about Artemis. There's no evidence whatsoever in the pastoral epistles that Paul has Artemis in mind. This was one of the chief weaknesses of the Krugers' work back in 1992, and Glahn has repeated their mistake in Nobody's Mother. So let's talk about this. There's no evidence. So this is going to be a very popular phrase in his article here, where he uses the word no evidence. And what he really means is that when he says no evidence, he's thinking like there's no thing in the text of 1 Timothy that makes it obvious that it's about Artemis, that it's a response to any of this cult stuff, this mythology, that Paul has any of this in mind. There's no like technically he's a little vague. Like certainly he doesn't think there's nothing obvious, but he would probably even say there's nothing even probably like you can say that's probably a reference, but we don't know for sure. It's like it's most likely, but yeah, that's probably what he's referring to here when he used the word evidence. But of course the problem is, of course, that that's entirely subjective. So like how we define what is evidence and what isn't evidence is all up to his opinion. You know, you can close your eyes and you can close your ears and you can be like, oh, there's no evidence, la la la. But clearly you're not going to hear any evidence and you're not going to see anything if you do that. So he's being a little vague here, and it seems like it's more of a rhetorical point to say, hey, like there is no reason to accept this view. Like it doesn't get off the ground. And what we'll talk about later is like there's actually a lot of reason to think this would be in reference to Artemis. First of all, whether you accept her view of 1 Timothy 2:12 or authority and teaching, all that, you can still accept that it's in reference to Artemis. Like the men could have been doing something with Artemis. Everybody agrees there's some men in reference here. It's not even that like big of a deal as far as this discussion of whether like women can be pastors or not. Um, so a real big reason why it's like not a big deal to for not mentioning Artemis, like he's like, hey, Paul never mentions Artemis, and the problem with saying that is like, well, yeah, that would be really helpful for the discussion if he did, but we wouldn't expect him to because Paul doesn't ever mention any of the gods of the other countries or you know religions in any of his texts. So we would not expect him to mention it. So we naturally have to go off of mostly vague references to understand what Paul is thinking about. Let's see what else I should have to say on that one. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So he doesn't. Yeah. Like if he's writing to the original audience, First Timothy, like they're gonna know like what the problems are happening in the church. He doesn't have to specifically say, "Hey, yeah, this is a response to Artemis. You can't teach. Women can't teach because this cult of Artemis is doing about." Like they already know all of that stuff. So when someone says like Paul in the passage, he'll say something like he'll say uh, you know likewise the women are to dress in suitable apparel with modesty and self-control. Their adornment must not be with braided hair and gold or pearls or expensive clothing. So like hypothetically, let's just say that Paul, like the people in that Paul's addressing, hypothetically they are um, the only people that are wearing all these gold or pearls are women that work for the Artemis cult or whatever. And they're trying to be Christian, but they're not, and there's like mixed feelings about it. Well, like you don't have to say, hey, the people of the Artemis cult have to stop doing this. Like you can just vaguely reference like what they shouldn't do. You don't have to specifically say, hey, that's the Artemis cult, because everybody knows that those specific people would be the ones who Paul will be responding to. Yeah, obviously you have to make your case for that, but but like there doesn't need to be a specific reference to the Artemis cult or anything like that. At the same time, uh, I think Michael Bird does a good job, little example of why we don't need these specific references when we're reading the Bible. So, for example, Michael Bird says, Paul says, "Do not forbid speaking in tongues." But okay, I'm gonna skip that part. I got to the wrong one. All right. First, Burk says that Paul doesn't explicitly mention Artemis or the Artemis cult in the pastoral epistles. True, but 1 Corinthians 8-9 is about the collection for the Jerusalem church, and Paul never once used the word for money. In Paul's letter to the Romans, he is writing in the aftermath of the expulsion and return of Jewish Christians to Rome, which Paul never mentions, but its effect on the contents of the letter are everywhere. In Romans 13, Paul doesn't mention Nero, but we know that Nero is in mind. Some things are just too obvious to need explicit statement. They are just part of the scenery or the assumed backstory. So he also mentions Burke cannot imagine some women in the Ephesians church still participating. Okay, that's actually later. Sorry. So yeah, like we don't need that specifically. Yeah, the Temple of Artemis was one of the 7 wonders of the world. Artemis was the focus of all of Ephesus. Uh, like when we give references to movies and stuff like that, we don't always specifically say, "Hey, like this is a reference to Spider-Man." Like great power comes great responsibility. Like everybody's gonna think of Spider-Man, but like we don't have to specifically say, "Oh yeah, this quote is from Spider-Man." Let's see. Yep. And not only that, but there's a lot of references in her book that he doesn't mention at all that are what she just proposes are examples of Paul referencing the Artemis cult, stuff like that. So I'll go through the list here really quickly, but you got to read the book if you want more detail analysis on that. So let's see. Yeah, so Paul says young widows are going around from house to house talking about things they should not. And the interesting thing about that is 1 Timothy 5:13 says, and besides that, going around from house to house, they learn to be lazy, and they are not only lazy but also gossips and busybodies, talking about things they should not. There are some scholars like Peterson who argue that one should instead translate gossip as those who talk nonsense, and busybodies are those who practice magic. Now, if he's practicing magic, if if the Artemis cult is the big thing in Ephesus, there's a good chance that would be in reference to the magic arts of Artemis. Acts 19:19, in the context of referring to the Artemis cult, says uses the word magic arts, uh, which is very similar, if not the same word. Yeah, it's a very similar word to the one in 1 Timothy 5:13. And Paul's second letter to Timothy says there are women being deceived and references magic. Paul mentions temple language reminiscent of Artemis's temple in 1 Timothy 3:15. Paul describes God as a light, just like Artemis in 1 Timothy 6:16. Paul calls Christianity a mystery similar to Artemis. Sandra Glahn specifically says, whereas inscriptions describe an Artemis-related mystery, Paul exclaims, great is the mystery of godliness, and the mystery of our religion is great. Paul says God possesses immortality, even though Artemis is said to be the first and only. Paul calls Christ the Savior, like Artemis is called. Paul tells women to not wear fancy things in a city that connects worship with status. Paul wants Ephesus to be free of greed in a city where wealth is connected with religion. And even a really interesting argument she made was that 1 Corinthians 7:8 says single women should remain single. But in 1 Timothy 5:14, it says to marry and bear children. Considering Artemis was a virgin goddess whose cult emphasized celibacy, not getting married, then this would make a lot of sense why Paul would be specifically saying that. So we see a possible reference there. So all this stuff, it's not conclusive. So maybe the writer here doesn't consider this specifically evidence. Okay, and maybe I wouldn't even say like, hey, it is probably, like, this is probably not for sure, but probably a reference to Artemis. No, I'm not an expert enough to know that. And it's a little too vague. A lot of those things are just a little too vague to know for sure. With that being said, with that being said, it's possible. And the important part of that is, say there's a 2% chance of each of those references being in reference to Artemis. If you add all those up and they get above 50%, that gives you a more than probably likely chance of it being about Artemis. So I don't see how the argument is a red herring. So we'll talk about this. Clark Worledge says, but is anyone in early church saying that 1 Corinthians 8-9 is not talking about money? Is anyone saying that Romans 13 is not concerned about Nero? Right, exactly. So nobody's saying that, which is that's his point. So he is saying, Michael Bird is saying, hey, nobody debates that these are talking about money and Nero, even though they're not explicitly mentioned. And why that's significant is when we get over here to 1 Timothy, the point is that, hey, we can have a clear instance in these other texts where it might not be explicitly mentioned, but we should be okay with saying, hey, it's probably a reference to Artemis. And so, like, no, that doesn't, of course, prove that 1 Timothy is talking about Artemis. But when he says, like, when Denny says, hey, like, there's no evidence, it is not mentioned at all, well, that's just not enough evidence, or like that's not a good enough reason to say, hey, like, it's clearly not. I hope that made sense. RBH, we will talk about Israel another time. You can reference my response with Taryn Williams to Mike Wigger on that topic in our series there. So all right, let's keep going. Yep. So there's no evidence. Glahn's main argument in favor of reading Paul through the lens of the Artemis cult doesn't come from 1 Timothy, but from Acts 19, which records Paul's confrontation with worshippers of Artemis in Ephesus. Glahn contends that Acts 19 reveals a major religious context from which false teaching of concern to Paul likely originated, the Artemis cult. She even goes so far as to suggest female believers in Ephesus may have been praying to Artemis while being Christians. So, yeah, so like she makes a whole bunch of different arguments. I don't think it'd be correct to say that like that is her main argument, but maybe he is like that's like her first one, and that's why he mentions it. I don't know. Um, Acts 19 clearly helps us know that the church in Ephesus was dealing with Artemis. Like that's no question, and we wouldn't even need Acts 19 to know that. Like just from the knowing the culture, that's clearly going to be part of it. All right. So she even goes to far as to suggest female believers in Ephesus may have been praying to Artemis while being Christians. So this is something that he did not like. Okay, so he says, leaving aside the fact that such a practice is incompatible with any credible claim to following Christ. There's no evidence in Acts 19 that the Ephesian believers were Artemis worshippers. On the contrary, the sign they were indeed believers was that they turned decisively from such things. A riot broke out against the new believers in Ephesus precisely because the Christians were perceived as a threat to the Artemis cult. All right, so, well, thanks, buddy. I'm sure you look great too. All right, I'm a dork. All right, so let's see here. I've got a little quote here. I guess not. All right. So he's saying that, leaving aside the fact that such a practice is incompatible with any credible claim to following Christ. So what she's saying is that it is possible that they were female believers in Ephesus praying to Artemis while being a Christian. And he cites Matthew 6:24 and 1 Corinthians 10:14-22. Okay. And this is, just to be clear, this is not a huge argument she's making. Like, this is just a brief quote. She's saying it is possible that there were people, and I think most people would even say that it was probable, just because the way people when you convert, the way most people respond. So Michael Bird, who has written about this topic, he talks about this in his response. Let's find out where that is. Okay, yeah. So Michael Bird says, second, Burk cannot imagine some women in the Ephesian churches still participating in the Artemis cult. Well, I've written books on religious conversion in antiquity, and I regularly talk to missiologists. What I've learned in this, when people get converted to Christianity, very often Christianity just becomes an add-on to their existing beliefs. They engage in a de facto synchronization of Christ's faith with Buddhism, animism, or Artemis. It can take years to fully prune the old religious baggage before having a robust Christian faith. When I first became a Christian, I was still something of a religious pluralist, many paths upon the mountain. Until my pastor took me to John 14:6 and explained that Jesus is the only Savior. So that is just one example, but the important relevance here is, like, clearly there were going to be some people that were they worshipped Artemis, and they became Christian. They said, I believe in God, and I believe that Jesus is the Savior. It is not as if Paul went to every single one of these people and said, do you believe in God? Do you also believe in Artemis? Well, you can't believe in Artemis, you have to believe in God, only one. And like, okay, so Acts 19, maybe that's not specifically referencing these people because there's nothing specifically in the text to think that, but that's okay. Glahn specifically said, like, it was possible. Additionally, yeah, so someone can clearly follow Christ and still believe that there are other lower G gods. Like, they could still believe God is the top tippity God, the main God, and then other lower G gods are like angels. And clearly someone can also believe that that Artemis still had, maybe like they viewed Artemis kind of like the power of an angel, but that's possible they could have still wanted to pray to her. Of course, there's cognitive dissonance. So even though two views might contradict, people all the time have contradictory views. And in regards to these two verses that Denny mentions here, so Matthew 6:24, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. So this is a passage on, the Sermon on the Mount, and pretty much everybody knows that Jesus speaks in hyperbole all the time. So he's quoting this verse as, like, I guess a proof text to say that it is incompatible with any credible claim to following Christ. But what as I said, Jesus used hyperbole all the time. Like, this isn't like I don't know of anyone who, like, literally, well, maybe some people do interpret this super literally, but in other words, maybe this is good reason, but he just mentions it, so he doesn't, like, give us a strong reason to take his specific view of this passage. In 1 Corinthians 10:14-22, it's a long one about idols and, like, shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? But, like, it's not like any of these verses are like what it takes to be a Christian. Like, none of them say, like, hey, you can't believe in that God has power, also that Artemis has power. So then he later says there's no evidence in Acts 19 that Ephesian believers were Artemis worshippers. He uses that no evidence word again. So they did the sign they were indeed believers was that they turned decisively from such things, which is true. Like, I'm sure there were a lot of great, strong believers there. At the same time, it doesn't mean there wasn't, non the people that believed in Artemis and God. Additionally, a riot broke out against the new believers in Ephesus precisely because the Christians were perceived as a threat to the Artemis cult, and which is, like, totally fine, doesn't contradict Glahn's view. The idea that Artemis' worship had a continuing hold on to the believers in Ephesus has no basis in Acts 19. Yeah, so I don't have the quote in front of me here, but I don't think Glahn specifically argues that anyways. Nor does it have a basis in any later development. By the time John wrote Revelation, the Ephesian church had developed a reputation for doctrine, fidelity, and resistance to false teaching. So they might have been known for this great, strong faith, which is great. Doesn't contradict her views. Anyway, so Paul never mentions Artemis or her cult to ground his argument in 1 Timothy. He does, however, mention explicitly the creation order in Genesis 2. So he never mentions Artemis or her cult. So, like, that's what's up for debate, whether she isn't mentioned, and she listed a whole bunch of different reasons. We broadly mentioned them today, but she didn't address, or he didn't address any of those in the article here. But her cult to ground his argument in 1 Timothy. He does, however, mention explicitly the creation order in Genesis 2. Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. So this is right after he says, like, women can't teach or, authentain, whatever that means, over a man. Paul also alludes to the curse on Eve's fertility in Genesis 3:16 in the phrase "saved through childbearing." So this was interesting because the "saved through childbearing" can refer to Genesis 3:16, where it's where one specific translation says, "To the woman he said, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children." But there's a lot of other views on that specific passage, a highly debated passage, which says other things that wouldn't be a reference. So the "saved through childbearing" very easily could be a reference to Genesis 3:15, which specifically says, that the seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent, and then the serpent will, bite at the heel or whatever. But, like, that could be in reference here. So we can't typically assume that it's Genesis 3:16 that's in reference here. And then he says, why should anyone read the text as a coded polemic against Artemis worship when Paul explicitly appeals to Genesis 2:3 as the primary background? He says, She says Glahn doesn't provide sufficient justification for such a move. So let's talk about that. Yep. All right. So this is the significance of Adam being formed first. So she says that, but Adam was formed first. Not. Oh, you guys can't see that. That's awkward. Well, what am I doing? All right. But Adam was formed first, not deceived. Should not be understood as a male first creation order that equals hierarchy, either in this world or the next. Rather, the truths that Adam was first and Eve was deceived restore interdependence in a context in which pride of creation order in a goddess first context emphasizes preeminence and autonomy. In the Ephesian origin story, Artemis is first. It is one of her titles. In her own creation story, with its female-male pairing, she is firstborn. So in this text, or texts of the ancient world involving Artemis and the creation accounts and all that, this the meaning behind the passage emphasizes preeminence and autonomy. But for Paul to say, "Oh no, that's not how it was. This is how it was," and referencing Genesis, then that takes away this idea of autonomy and preeminence. That's important for what Paul's trying to say. Paul's Lord was begotten, not created, in firstborn over all creation. So there is no parallel creation story of his beginning. So this is one I'd say, like, that makes it kind of difficult to say this is what Paul is referring to when he mentions this Adam was formed first thing and it being a polemic. This is one of the negatives because there's not a parallel there. So like there is a parallel, but it's like not a really strong one. So that makes it like a little bit speculative at the same time. She says, but in the creation of humanity, the Genesis story, the man is first in a male-female pairing, and he was not even the one deceived. The apostle corrects this false story with the true one. He's using a narrative to counter a competing narrative. All right. Anything else worth mentioning there? I appreciate your guys' patience. All right. Yep, I think that's it there. All right. All right. So we're going to get rid of that one. All right. And we're going to go back here. All right, we're good there. So, and to specifically answer his question, why should anyone read the text as a code of polemic against Artemis worship when Paul explicitly appeals to Genesis 2-3 as the primary background? Which I don't understand this question. It's like it's kind of a weird question. The reason is because, like he's asking, like, why should you do that if Genesis 2-3 is the primary background? But the reason you do that is because it's a polemic. So, it's like it's not circular reasoning. It's like he's asking why, and like why. I guess what he's mainly saying is like why we should actually take this view in general when Genesis 2-3 being the primary background is I guess a stronger view. I don't know. He doesn't necessarily argue for his position here, and I mean I don't think that she would in any way say like it's certain or it is probably. Maybe she would say it's probably, but it's a vague passage, a vague reference. So she's giving her an argument for her position. Obviously you don't have to take it, but it does make a little bit of sense. So I will also get into that a little bit later. And she spends more time arguing in the book, like why the whole saved through childbearing thing would be so important. But in her interpretation of 1 Timothy 2:12, Glahn marshals a grab bag of egalitarian exegesis that results in interpretive incoherence. For example, Glahn argues that Paul doesn't issue a universal prohibition on women teaching men. Rather, Paul means to address only husbands and wives in particular. This same idea has been presented recently by Gordon Hugenberger, reflecting a novel way of limiting the significance of the passage, to which Tom Schreiner has responded. So he doesn't mention any of her arguments. She mentioned a bunch of them. She doesn't I guess he's saying like, hey, somebody's responded over here, so I'm not going to address it here, which is like fine. But I guess we'll just have to look at Gordon Hugenberger's article another time. So he says, moreover, Glahn claims that by saying, I am not allowing a wife to teach a husband, Paul merely cites his preference for this particular local situation where the Undermine cult had unduly influenced Christian wives. Nevertheless, she then argues that to teach or exercise authority is one idea, not two, and that the exercise of authority should be viewed negatively. Thus, she interprets Paul as saying, I am not permitting a wife to teach with a view to domineering a husband. I do appreciate that, like, he does miss some things here and there, but he does a pretty good job, I'd say, of like summarizing her view, which I really appreciated. It's really difficult and frustrating to read a biblical scholar or maybe even a local or a layperson responding to like a book like hers, and they'd be like, "Oh yeah, that's definitely wrong," when like they don't even understand the position at all. So, good on here for the most part there. So, Glahn doesn't seem to realize it's incoherent to argue that Paul prohibits wives from domineering their husbands, while also arguing the prohibition addresses only a local situation. While both are common egalitarian interpretations, they don't make sense when held together. If Paul addresses only a local situation and doesn't give a universal principle, wouldn't that mean Paul personally doesn't allow wives to domineer their husbands in Ephesus, but he might allow it elsewhere? So, what he's saying is, if Paul is saying like, hey, you can only like women can't domineer their husbands in this situation, he's thinking, well, doesn't that mean that like if we take this interpretation, wouldn't that mean that Paul was okay with him doing it elsewhere? And of course, the answer is no. Like, you can say one specific thing, like, "Hey, don't do this in this specific situation," but that says nothing about the other situation. Like maybe in the specific context of saying, "Hey, like, don't eat hamburger. You should never eat hamburgers." That maybe in the context like that might apply like always, but it also could not imply. And it all depends on the context of why you say things, stuff like that. He says, since it's not an apostolic prohibition, but a personal preference, wouldn't that mean other churches might allow wives to domineer their husbands? Glahn's interpretation is incoherent at this point. Yeah. So yeah, same thing there. Um, yeah. So let's see. Yeah. Yeah, so like imagine a city government enacts a policy banning single-use plastic bags in grocery stores due to concern about environmental pollution. This policy is implemented specifically to address the local issue of plastic waste in that city. But it wouldn't mean that that same government might um, still want to address it in other places, but they can still in like one specific context say, "Hey, we don't want you guys doing this," but obviously that says nothing about what they think other people should do. I hope that makes sense. Um, later he says, Glahn's exegetical work supporting these contradictory claims leaves much to be desired. She argues that the present tense of "I am not allowing" emphasizes this is merely Paul's personal practice in Ephesus. Uh, so yeah, let's dive into the passage just a little bit here, just so people have a little bit better context here. So um, there's a lot said in this passage. We're not going to go through it all. Paul says something about modesty and self-control. That's another discussion. Don't spend all your value and effort wearing gold and pearls, expensive clothing. Focus on good deeds. Then he says a woman must learn quietly with all submissiveness. And just to be clear, this is just one specific translation. There's a lot of debate on this passage, and then he says, this specific translation says, but I do not allow a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. She must remain quiet, for Adam was formed first and then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman, because she was fully deceived, fell into transgression. But she will be delivered through childbearing if she continues in faith and love and holiness with self-control. So once again, we have teaching, exercise authority, remain quiet. Adam was formed first. This idea of childbearing, all interesting debates here. So in this specific, what he's responding to, she argues the present tense of "I am not allowing" emphasizes this is merely Paul's personal practice in Ephesus. But the present tense in Greek doesn't indicate any such thing. She says the fact that Paul uses the first person pronoun "I" lends this interpretation even more credibility. Yet the Greek text doesn't have a first person personal pronoun. These are basic mistakes in Greek, and yet she cites them as justification for reducing Paul's apostolic position to a mere unauthoritative opinion. So definitely a lot of rhetoric there, saying to a mere unauthoritative opinion. Mere, like that just doesn't mean, like, almost like she's attacking Paul is the the thing there, like, oh, Paul's just, who cares, basically. But on this specific here, let's see what we're going to talk about here. Yeah. So yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah. Okay. So first of all, let's look at what she actually said. I think that could give us a little better idea. So she says that, we'll skip down a little bit to like the fourth or fifth line here. So she says, reading I'm not allowing as a progressive statement emphasizes the idea that disallowing is the practice of this particular author. That differs from a directive or command, and it also suggests that he did not necessarily intend for this instruction to stand for all people in all places and for all time. So, uh, so what is the author's name here? Gosh, Denny. So Denny says that, like this mention of I is a reason, like, to think that, oh, this is just talking about Paul's opinion. And just to be clear, like, she never says this is a reason. Well, I guess technically she would say it was a reason, but she wouldn't say that it indicates such a thing. The way I'm reading it here is she says it also suggests that he did not necessarily intend. So I think he would be right if she said it suggests that he intended for his instruction to not stand for all people. But she says no. She says suggests he did not necessarily intend. So what she's saying is that it is still possible that it could be a like, it's my interpretation type of situation. And later she says not all present tense verbs are to be understood this way. So she says that it's like not certain in any way, or like not every single time the word I is used, it is a it is like the way she's arguing. But what gives us more possibility, more credibility, is the addition of a first person pronoun I am not allowing. As mentioned, one sees similar first person language elsewhere when the Apostle Paul refers to the unmarried. In his instructions for the Corinthians regarding virgins, he writes that I have no command from the Lord, but I give my opinion as one shown mercy by the Lord to be trustworthy. So it gives it more credibility. It doesn't make it certain. Although I do find it interesting that Philip Payne does argue a little bit more in depthly about why we could, adds to the probability that maybe this is just Paul's opinion. But I don't think even Philip Payne would say like this is certain anyway. So like, it could indicate it, but it's not certain. That's how I interpret her meaning here. But interpreting or summarizing everybody correctly is almost impossible in this discussion. So, like, this is it's a difficult discussion. It's hard to understand exactly what people are saying. But yeah, so on. So she says the fact that Paul uses the first person pronoun I lends this interpretation even more credibility. Yet the Greek text doesn't have a first person personal pronoun. And then he says these are basic mistakes in Greek. So this is an interesting question. All right. So she says the fact that Paul used the first person pronoun I lends this interpretation even more credibility. So I have mixed feeling about this because, like, on one hand, okay, so she has a PhD. She's writing on this, like, really, dare I even say nerdy, like, very, like, historical, you know, Ephesus and Artemis and all this other stuff. And for her to make a simple, really easy, like, basic Greek 101 mistake would be like, "What? That is so odd. Like, how did she mess that up?" And in other parts of her book, she uses all these like, really complex arguments for Greek and understanding the grammar, all that kind of stuff. So how does she mess this part up here by, um, you know, thinking that the text, do, like, it has a first personal pronoun? So let's actually look at what the actual text says. So we are here. All right. So it says, like, I'm not going to read in Greek, but specifically here, epitrepo. All right. I do permit. And as you can tell, like, this is just one word, but in English it is three words in this specific translation. So why people translate it as the I is because of the form of the word, specifically the ending there. Although there might be other reasons to translate that way, whichever. The point being, like, hey, yeah, it is talking from the perspective of Paul, like I. At the same time, it doesn't specifically use the word, um, the I, which is ego, um, if I'm correct there. But so yeah, so what he's saying is the Greek text doesn't have a first personal pronoun. So my one way to look at it is maybe she just completely made a silly mistake and she just doesn't know Greek, or she makes all these basic mistakes in Greek, or she's speaking in regards to like a lay audience perspective, like, how can I make this really simple for someone who doesn't understand Greek? And she says, hey, the she says specifically, um, yeah, the addition of a first person pronoun, I'm not allowing. So she's referring to the addition of the first person pronoun in regards to in English, which it communicates the same thing in Greek, but it just uses a different way of communicating that than we might expect. So does this mean she doesn't understand Greek? Like, I have no way to know that. I would say probably not, but at the same time, it doesn't change her argument. Um, it seems like, yeah, it's worth mentioning. Like, maybe she should have been a little bit more specific, but avoid confusion at the same time. I don't. It doesn't change her argument, so I don't see how, like, hating on basic mistakes in Greek, and she, like, that's a very rhetorical thing. Like, it seems like he's trying to say, like, hey, yeah, she doesn't know what she's talking about. It's just the seems like what he's trying to convey here. So crucial to Glahn's case is the assertion that women were among the first false teachers in Ephesus. In 1 Timothy 1:3, Paul tells Timothy, remain on at Ephesus in order that you may charge certain men not to teach strange doctrines. So this is the 1984 NIV. Glahn observes that certain men translates the Greek pronoun tissin, which is neuter. She alleges that because Paul employs a neuter pronoun, it can refer to both men and women. She's going to hate on, or he's going to, heavily critique her a lot here. So what is the context? Like, this is the very beginning of the letter, and so pretty much the very first thing Paul is saying. So she's like, hey, yeah, this could certainly be a reference to what Paul is referring to. There's people that are spreading false teachings, and that maybe we should think like, maybe that's what Paul is referring to when he's talking about these women thing. And if it's a local thing, then that's important for the argument, because if it's local, then maybe that shouldn't apply to all places everywhere. Maybe only in Ephesus women shouldn't be teaching or exercising authority. That's her argument. But later we will read from him. Again, there are elementary linguistic problems here. If the expression were neuter, it wouldn't be referring to any person at all. So what he is referring to is grammatical neuter. So we can, we're on our little Greek interlinear here. If you want to do your research here, if you don't know Greek, that's okay. You can, look into it really easily. So if you hover over the little blue part, it'll say dative, masculine, plural. So that, most of the time, what those things are correct. In this specific instance, probably correct. But but like you can like this isn't like certain every single time. Sometimes the reason they put it on these is up for interpretation. Either way, she said that it was neuter. So why would she say this word tissen is neuter? Well, let's look at what she said. Hopefully I actually have her quote. Yep, I do. Look at that. Wow. Okay. So she says this because she says, while NASB 1995 and NIV 1984 identified those teaching false doctrine as men, Trombley points out that the Greek text uses a neuter pronoun, perhaps better translated certain persons or some, thus allowing for both male and female teachers. This detail is significant as it opens the possibility that at least some teachers of falsehood in Ephesus are women. So what she exactly means by neuter is an important question. She is citing from Trombley. I look at Trombley, like it's not terribly clear what he was referring to either. So, she's kind of just like citing pretty much word for word kind of thing. But yeah, the question is like, what did she mean by neuter? Did she mean like grammatical neuter, or did she mean in English? Like if I said, the word one or certain people, like are those specifically masculine people? Or are they the neuter? And like that is one interpretation of what she means. She's a PhD. You'd think that she would understand what neuter is in Greek. Is she referring to that, or is she writing from the perspective of someone that only knows English because that's her main audience? Not terribly clear, but I would not say that she is wrong for this. Either way, let's look into what he responds to her by saying. He says, oh, we gotta take that down. All right. He says, again, there are elementary linguistic problems here. If the expression were neuter, it wouldn't be referring to any person at all. So what he's saying is that when we look at the word tissen in Greek, that if this was grammatically neuter, that it would be referring to, I guess, something that was like an object and not a person, not male or female. It would be like a maybe, I guess not an animal. An animal wouldn't be a good example, but like a barrel or a sword, like maybe that could be neuter. I don't know. That's probably not a good example. That's okay. You get the point. So he says, even though the form of the word in verse 3 is the same for masculine, feminine, and neuter, so what he's saying is this word tissen, that would look exactly the same whether it's masculine, feminine, or neuter. So even though it says masculine plural here, technically it is exactly the same whether it be masculine, feminine, or neuter. And what he's saying is like, hey, you have to know by the context. And First Timothy, or this interlinear at least, is saying it's masculine plural, probably because of the context. But then they say the same word appears in verses 6 and 8, where both are clearly masculine. So let's look at 6 and 8. We'll look at it in English and then in Greek. He says, verse 6 says, some have strayed from these and turned away to empty discussion. So feel free to read all this. You can read all of 3 to 8, and you won't notice anything, in the English at least, regarding masculinity, the people being specifically masculine. So what is he referring to? He is referring to the grammatical nature of them being masculine. So the same words appear in verses 6 and 8. So let's go to 6. Six. Tennis, some. And this translation, they translate, although they say it's masculine plural, some is like vague, like it could be men, could be women. But what he's referring to is, hey, it's clearly, what he says is clearly masculine plural, and therefore it must be referring to men. That is his argument, is what it seems like. And the same for 8. We can look at 8 real quick here. Yeah, it's tis, so a little bit different of a word, but he says that it's clearly masculine. And I guess he thinks that it's talking about the same people. Then he says the related participle desiring, wanting in verse 7 is also clearly masculine. So verse 7, desiring, and that is, it's clearly masculine. You know what he says, but it's like a little weird. Okay, we'll keep, yeah. Okay, so then he says also charge in verse 3 reappears in verses 5 and 18, which connect Paul's admonition to specific male apostates in verse 20. The only false teachers named in 1 Timothy are men. So what he's referring to is at the very end of the passage, he says, or of chapter 1 at least, he says, I put this charge before you, Timothy, my child, in keeping with the prophecies once spoken about you, in order that with such encouragement you may fight the good fight. To do this, you must hold firmly to faith and a good conscience, which some have rejected, and so have suffered shipwreck in regard to the faith. So, as you probably guessed, that word some is going to be the word that Denny is referring to. That was just a guess, probably right though. So, yep, tennis, some. Okay, so masculine. So holding faith and a good conscience, which some have cast away, concerning the faith, have caused a shipwreck. All right. So all these words in Greek are masculine. So, and they also connect 18, which is the very end of 18 says, among these are Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I handed over to Satan to be taught not to blaspheme. So what it's like he's saying, or I mean, I could read it, but which connects Paul's admonition to specific male apostates in verse 20. So basically what he's saying is like this reference of verse 20 of men connects it with verse 18 or 19, and actually that's 18. So maybe I misquoted her. Where are we at here? I'm not sure actually what he was referring to in 18. What am I missing? Oh, charge. Charge in verse 18. Yes, sorry about that, guys. So charge in verse 18. Yes, perengilion is it's looks like that is actually feminine singular. Okay, but what he's saying is that it's the same word. He's placing a charge. This charge I commit to you. And the very beginning of verse 3, he says, let's see. What's that word? Charge. What am I missing? Sorry, guys. I guess maybe, yeah, there you go. Yeah, you might warn, Perengilius. All right, so she basically saying like it's this using the same words, so it's that same charge being mentioned, and all the same people in reference in verse 3 are also used in verse 19, and there just happen to be in verse 20 two men mentioned, so that all these grammatical and two men mentioned. The only false teachers named in First Timothy are men, and therefore this word in 1:3 must refer to men, or probably refers to men. Now, I'm not sure exactly why he would say this so confidently. So, for one, anytime you use the word like the grammatical nature of verbs or something like tissen, it can be masculine. It could be it could be grammatically masculine, but it can also refer to men and women. It's the same thing for the participle mentioned. So now if it was feminine, then that means it would only refer to women. But like in this specific instance, tissen is exactly the same. So we don't know exactly specifically what is the context determines that. Now, I would assume that most translations interpret as certain, or most translations that interpret it as certain men would be doing that based on the context. But even if you say certain men, that can still be referring to women as well. Kind of like the word man, like a, well, that maybe a better example is one or anyone, or what's some other better examples there? Um, almost there, guys. Sorry. actually. It's hard keeping all my notes together here. All right. Yeah, so grammatically masculine doesn't mean much because even if it's grammatically masculine, it could refer to men and women. This is very similar to that discussion of First Timothy 3:3, um, when it mentions that like that any one idea. You can watch my previous video on First Timothy 3 in response to Mike Winger and Terry Williams and all that. Like for example, the it's the same as saying because the word they in English refers to men in one paragraph, it also must be referring to men, they, used in a later paragraph. As a linguistic grammatical point, that is simply wrong. I say Dave and Steve, they were eating cake. Later on, I said hello to Helen and her husband. They were washing the car. The first they refers to two men, the second they refers to man and a woman. The same pronoun can refer to different folks each time it is used. And another thing worth mentioning here is that the oh yeah, I'm on the wrong one. Sorry guys. At verse 20, the very first word is among. In Greek it is hon, which is like like so it's talking about a group of people, some, and then it goes specifically among who are these two men. So even if those two men are specifically masculine, that doesn't help us understand who the people before that were. But either way, for some reason, he says the technical errors in Glahn's work are damaging, but there are also other examples of shaky scholarship. For example, Glahn follows the work of egalitarians Philip Payne and Linda Belleville to establish that Paul means to prohibit wives teaching with a view to domineering their husbands. She then summarily rejects the work of complementarians, calling out Schreiner and Kostenberger on this point, yet providing no citation of the work. Yeah, so this was a little weird. If you go to that reference, yeah, they mention them and they mention the work, but they don't she doesn't specifically cite them. So I was like, well, I guess I won't be able to figure out what article or book she was referring to there. But elsewhere, she does cite the important volume edited by Schreiner and Kostenberger, but she interacts only with the 2005 edition, not the 2016 edition. It's like, I mean, that's a minor critique. Like, maybe, yeah, I think you should definitely say that she should address the biggest arguments, the strongest arguments. I guess Denny thinks that the biggest arguments, the strongest ones were in Schreiner's book, the newer version, but maybe she didn't think so. Maybe she didn't know. Hard to tell. He says, this may seem like straining nets, but it isn't. The 2016 edition of Schreiner and Kostenberger's Women in the Church is the most important work refuting the claims of the scholars Glahn relies on in Nobody's Mother. Glahn has no critical interaction with this edition anywhere in her book. Consequently, she completely overlooks crucial exegetical evidence that undermines her case. Glahn wishes to convince readers that Paul doesn't give a universal prohibition on women teaching and having authority over men. Yet her exegesis on these points is too flawed to be persuasive. Yeah, that's a great example, Elizabeth. Yeah, so if you said, hey guys, like that can refer to women, can refer to men. Like I actually said literally earlier, I said, hey guys, like in referring to, what possibly could have been only women. So yeah, masculine plural can be a mixed group. And in Greek, it's the same word with like brothers. What is that? Adelphoi or something like that. It includes brothers and sisters, or can include depending on the context. Um, uh, then save through childbearing, a local saying. Okay, Glahn argues the words save through childbearing don't derive from Paul, but likely derive from the Artemis cult. The women in Ephesus knew that Artemis was a midwife who would either save women from the perils of childbirth or gently euthanize them to spare them pain. Paul picks up the expression to communicate that Ephesian women don't have to look to Artemis for help during childbirth. They can trust in Jesus, who will save them from dying due to complications in childbirth. This isn't a promise for all Christian women, Glahn says, but only for the Christian women in Ephesus during this period. This interpretation is perhaps the most unpersuasive of all. To establish "saved through childbearing" as a slogan from the Artemis cult, Glahn appeals to instances in 1 Corinthians in which Paul quotes local slogans. This overlooks the fact that Paul's rhetorical strategy in 1 Corinthians differs dramatically from that of 1 Timothy. It also overlooks specific criteria for identifying slogans in 1 Corinthians, criteria that are largely absent in 1 Timothy. For these reasons and more, Glahn's explanation of "saved through childbearing" is unpersuasive. So, what is the main critiques here? He says that they differ dramatically from that of 1 Timothy and 1 Corinthians. So, I guess maybe to make the argument more specific, he's saying that she shouldn't quote from 1 Corinthians as support of her argument when something's going on that's very, very different in 1 Corinthians. And he says that criteria that are largely absent. So I guess there's specific criteria we have to have in 1 Corinthians in order to figure out if it's a quote, I guess. He doesn't go into specific details, so I guess all we can do is trust him that there's of this specific criteria. I guess my problem with this is, like, if you read her book, she mentions a whole bunch of different arguments for why this should be considered a slogan. Most specifically, and like the obvious one, what I would even consider evidence, is in something that most translations kind of miss. So, and there is certainly debate about this, and it's not certain, but it makes things really interesting. And this is, like, if there is any kind of evidence that is mentioned, like, this should certainly be considered evidence that we'll talk about in a second. And just to be clear, I think a much better way to describe evidence is to use the word evidence as anything that raises the probability of a certain proposition being true. So he says, like, hey, there's no evidence that Artemis is what Paul's referring to. But if she says if Glahn mentions that Paul is saying things like this delivered through childbearing, when something like childbearing is so significant for the Artemis cult, and it is specifically written to a bunch of people that are very familiar with the Artemis cult, then, like, of course that raises the probability that that Paul was referring to the Artemis cult. No, it's not proof, and that I think that's what he means by evidence. But like, if there's 100 slight references to the Artemis cult, I think that's strong. That, like, it might by itself not be significant, but it all can add up, and that all can become, like, really strong evidence. But if you say, like, hey, yeah, there's no, like, one specific thing that's extremely convincing, well, then you're going to miss out on a lot of the other things that are more specific. Hope that I explained that well. Either way, tangent there. So he says, but she will be delivered through childbearing if she continues in faith and love and holiness with self-control. So, like, what does Paul mean by that? It's a really weird thing. She will be delivered through childbearing. Well, I think what is really strong evidence for this being a saying is it literally says right after that, this saying is trustworthy. So in English, a lot of people, specifically this translation, the NET, interpret this as referring to the passage right after that. If someone aspires to the office of overseer, he describes a good work. So maybe that is the trustworthy saying. But this little, what is this, a colon? I don't know. That's not in the Greek. We could pull it up here. So yeah, there's nothing. Oh, that's 1 Timothy 1. Oops. All right. Let's look at it. We'll go to the very bottom of 1 Timothy 2. So if they abide in faith and love and holiness with self-restraint, like, there's nothing, like, there's a period there. Is that in the Greek? I'm not even sure. And then 1 Timothy 3, well, it wouldn't be in the Greek because they didn't add the punctuation until a long time later. But either way, right after that, there's no, like, well, it looks like they added a colon, so that's really interesting. I wonder if that colon was added later. Like, I know for sure, like, the colons weren't added until way later, after the like the original text was written. Maybe someone can comment in the comments about the colon, but either way, trustworthy is the saying. It's right after that. There's nothing in the Greek specifically that says like, hey, yeah, this must be referring to the thing after that. But like he doesn't mention that, and she mentioned a whole bunch of other reasons to think that it might be. And we have other references that Paul says like, hey, this is a trustworthy saying. This is a saying. He says that before sometimes, and he also says it after sometimes. So there's no like specific reason why this couldn't be a saying that a slogan from the Artemis cult, um, but he doesn't mention any of the evidence in the book. I would like to see some, like before we discount our view, let's actually talk about the evidence. And let's see. Yep. So he says that like the First Corinthians has all this different criteria, and that it's are absent from First Timothy, but it doesn't mean like he's just like really vague about that, because even if there is criteria for specifically First Corinthians, that doesn't mean that there couldn't be other reasons why we should label as a slogan in First Timothy. Like there was no like specific way you notated slogans in this time period. He says, there's much more to Nobody's Mother than what I've covered in this brief review. For example, I haven't addressed her use of ancient sources, some of which were written too far after Paul's time to be relevant. Okay, so those are the page numbers. So, I mean, yeah. So like, written too far after Paul's time. So she discusses in the book. So I'm a little confused what he's referring to here, because she specifically discusses like, hey, just if it's written 100, 200, 300 years after Paul or before Paul, it's not as relevant, but it's still possible that that could still be what Paul's referring to. That just means that it was written later or before. Um, Later he says, nor have I discussed the problematic uses of trigger warnings appearing here and there in a discussion of agent sources. So like there were discussions about more PG content in like the creation texts of Artemis and stuff like that, and she would say like, "Hey, trigger warning," and I guess he doesn't like that for some reason. So I don't know what that's coming from. He says, which experts like these people and others argue may do more harm than good. So I don't know how that would be harmful to say that. Um, then he says, nor have I scrutinized her controversial claims that complementarianism is a break with the tradition of the Christian church, and that women's ordination is an idea that goes back to Pentecost and not merely to modern feminism. Um, he says, have to leave these and other worthy topics to other reviews. So yeah, a big discussion of hers is she mentions how there were a bunch of leaders throughout history, and that this whole egalitarianism thing isn't a response to feminism, and she even talks about how complementarianism is actually a break with tradition. Like the main view of church history, she argues, has to do more with like a sexist view, and that's why you shouldn't teach, because women were inferior to men according to said people. But she's like, yeah, the complementarian position that like women and men are equal, that's actually a very new view. But he says that Glahn's conclusions are a broadside against complementarian interpretations of this text. The book will take its place in the long line of egalitarian works that have, in one way or another, reduced Paul's words to a local concern with no abiding prohibition on women in church leadership. So I guess you could consider her work egalitarian. She doesn't claim that, as mentioned before. What I hope readers will be able to discern from this review is that the book's main arguments falls apart at numerous points. For all the scholarship Glahn marshals to sketch the contours of the Artemis cult in the first century Ephesus, she never really establishes the cult's relevance to the interpretation of 1 Timothy. As a result, her interpretation of 2:8-15 is ultimately unpersuasive. So, a few things to mention here. All right. Forgive me if I miss something in the comments that's worth mentioning. Maybe repeat yourself if I miss something. So, Yep. So he didn't talk about any of her arguments for why this is uh, a local prohibition, referring to First Corinthians 2:12. Maybe that was because someone like Schreiner responded earlier or something like that. But um, what else? Yeah, he didn't mention anything about like the braids or the like modesty and self-control and all that. Didn't mention anything about Authentane, or at least critiqued. Yeah. Um, okay. So yeah. Well, I guess my comments aren't the best. That's okay. Yep. So yes. Anyways, so she made lots of arguments. A lot of them were unaddressed. I would like to see some critiques of those, or why he would be against using those as evidence. Overall, I would say there were some interesting points made. At the same time, um, maybe they give us doubt about whether Artemis was in view in 1 Timothy 2:12. Hard to tell. What I would say is that Glahn makes many points, so you can reject some and not reject all of them. You can accept some and not accept all of them. There or you can be a complementarian and accept many of her views. So I don't know. You guys let me know what you think about his article. I will mention one more thing. See if Michael Bird said anything interesting. Yeah, so Michael Bird says, "Saved through childbearing is a tricky clause to understand, and there are all manner of options. Saved through Mary birthing Jesus. God's promise is life, not destruction, for faithful women. Saved from deception, or even saved by submitting to the patriarchy. While saved through childbearing may or may not be a slogan of the Artemis cult, it definitely sums up the prayer of women to Artemis. Goddess, give me a safe birth or a quick death." I think Paul is saying that Christ, not Artemis, is the patron deity for Christian women in childbirth, who calls them to a life of faith and virtue. Unlike Burke, I find that very persuasive because it marries together literary contents and socio-religious context. So, yeah, hopefully we'll have Michael Bird on the channel sometime soon. But otherwise, I appreciate you guys watching. I love to hear your feedback to her arguments, although we didn't get to discuss all of the evidence. I fear that someone might read this review and think, oh, her arguments are terrible because there's no evidence. And of course, he didn't mention most of the evidence she brought up. So why would you think that? So I don't know if you'd call that a misrepresentation, but and obviously that Denny's not he is not required to mention all of the different arguments that she holds. At the same time, it would have been nice to hear that. So um, that's true. Yeah. So Josiah says saved through doesn't necessarily mean by saved by. Good to keep in mind. So there's yeah, but there's a lot of interesting discussion about this where we'll have to have a more um, exhaustive discussion about what all those different words mean in another video. But yeah, let me know what you guys think of the article. Definitely make sure to subscribe so you can make sure to listen to my interview with Dr. Sandra Glahn and correct me how I I mispronounced her name. But otherwise, it's been fun, guys, and I hope you have a great rest of your night or day or whatever.